I work as a caregiver in some of the neighboring cities that I live in. I'm an RN, but I really enjoy working with patients in their own home. Most of the time, they are a lot nicer and personable with you, but that makes sense. Hospitals are cold and lonely, and you typically don't know many people there. It's not a place anyone would want to spend longer than, say, a normal appointment, right? So being able to make people comfortable at home while they heal or spend their last days means a lot to me. Now, some of the people I cared for lived in sketch places, and even some could be sketchy themselves, so I still had to be aware of my surroundings and keep myself safe as well as my patients. I wanted to share one of my experiences with you because I like how you mentioned these can be entertaining as well as educational. Because even though you may have the best at heart, that doesn't mean everyone else does. It was the beginning of spring 2018. I was caring for a gentle old lady that I'll call Mary. Mary suffered a stroke and was going through PT in order to walk again. She was able to talk for the most part and had control of her arm, but we were still working on walking and building up her strength again. I was there 4 to 5 times a week, and a PT nurse was there twice a week when I was there to help. Most days she was a trooper and willing to put in the effort, but everyone has their off days. It didn't happen often, so when it did, we tended to go a little easier on her. We may only go half the time or do something different, something she wanted to do. On this day, Mary was feeling a little under the weather, so we didn't want to push her if she physically wasn't feeling well. I called the PT and told her to reschedule, and I went about my normal tasks in the meantime, such as delving out her medication in the daily containers, changing bed sheets, laundry, running a bath for her, things like that. Mary was sitting on the couch watching TV when I went to the window to open the curtains. As I did so, I saw someone standing on the other side of the street. Mary was living in a condo, but it was like a retirement home because it was just seniors that lived there, but they weren't assisted living. So anyways, this man was a bit off-putting at first. You see, he wasn't some normally dressed guy. His face looked very pale, and he was wearing what looked like a very baggy white jumpsuit and was holding a briefcase. He wasn't doing anything else but standing there and watching as the cars drove by. My first thought was, that's weird, but I moved on with my schedule. After some time, I had forgotten all about this person. It wasn't until I was wrapping up for the day and heading out the door after a family member arrived that I was reminded of him. I walked to my car, which was facing right towards him, so I spotted him quickly. This time, I watched him slowly turn his head in my direction and smile and wave. Now that I was a little closer, I could tell the jumpsuit I saw was actually what looked like a really old clown costume. It was baggy and had buttons or a design going down the front center, and the sleeves were puffy. Again, I thought it was weird, maybe a little unsettling, but to hopefully keep the peace, I just waved back and quickly got in my car and left. I was going to Mary's the following day, so as I pulled up, I noticed our clown guy sitting on a bench on the same road as the condos. There was a single bench that had a sidewalk next to it that led to the front office doors. There was a tree next to the bench as well as a small flower bed that was there as a memorial. Residents used it mostly, but you occasionally saw some joggers or other people passing by using it, so it wasn't odd seeing him sit on it. It was just odd seeing someone dressed like that and sitting out there. I got out of my car, locked my door, and headed towards Mary's condo, trying to keep an eye on this guy as well. Unfortunately, he noticed me and immediately smiled and waved again. Instead of a full hand wave like he did last time, This one was just a simple lift of the hand and wiggling his fingers, almost like in a flirtatious way, I suppose. It was odd, but this time I just kind of fake smiled and approached her door. When I heard the buzz, I entered the door and proceeded with my day as normal. Towards the end of my shift, though, I looked out the window again and saw him still standing there. I asked Mary if she had seen the guy before, and she confirmed she did, but he had just been sitting on the bench, so she didn't see his face. She said she hadn't seen him do anything else and wasn't worried about him, so I figured I would drop it, thinking at the most, maybe he was just playing some stupid prank. It was the following day that I started getting a little worried. It was a Saturday, and I was off Sunday, so I picked up some items that Mary asked for from the store, or picked up takeout for her or small errands like that. When I got to the condos, I again saw the clown guy by the bench, but as I got out of my car, I noticed he started walking towards me. Not knowing what to expect, I tucked my keys between my fingers and made my way to the trunk to get the bags. When I closed it, the guy was now making eye contact with me and still walking towards me. I tried to ignore this and walk towards her door when this man let out the most blood-curdling scream I had ever heard. It made me jump to the point that I also yelped and dropped a bag. I quickly tried grabbing the bag and ran towards the door as the guy stopped moving and continued screaming, right there in the middle of the parking lot. This time, instead of knocking first like I usually do, I immediately twisted the doorknob, praying it was unlocked. Mary must have known I was going to be there soon and unlocked it. As I dashed in, I quickly closed the door, locked it, and realized Mary was on the couch, looking a little startled as well. I explained to her as calmly as I could what I had witnessed. She seemed confused and suggested I call security to look for them or have them patrol the area. I didn't hesitate and called them explaining what happened. After about 5 to 10 minutes, security knocked on the door to talk to me more about the situation. They told me that a few other residents reported it too, but since he hadn't done anything yet, they couldn't do much but patrol the area. They also said that when they would start their rounds, he was nowhere to be found. It was like he knew when he was being looked for and managed to hide. The security guy that night was always really nice and open with me, so he actually mentioned he was concerned the guy might know their scheduled rounds or even be on their same radio frequency and know when to flee the area. He told me to be careful when I come and go and to call for an escort if needed because he wasn't sure what his intentions were. So, as I mentioned, I can usually handle my own, but that certainly didn't make me feel any better about the situation, especially for Mary and her neighbors. When I left that night, I told her to keep her alert button and phone on her wherever she went, just to make sure she had some way of alerting someone. Lo and behold, when I got to my car, he was back across the street, smiling and waving. This time, I drove around to that side of the road, rolled down my window, and asked him why he was there. Again, he just smiled and started his piercing scream. So I drove away and called their main office again to tell them he was out there. It was pretty alarming knowing he was around a bunch of seniors, some of them not being able to defend themselves. So I called Mary when I got home, and even that Sunday throughout the day, to make sure she was okay. Thankfully, she had no contact with the guy, but security never found the guy either. Unfortunately, when I went there on Monday, he was there again. This time, I quickly made my way to Mary's door without even looking at the guy and quickly went in, alerting security. Everything else went as normal until the PT nurse Sarah showed up. I forgot she hadn't really encountered this guy until she was knocking at the door. I immediately went to open it and asked if she saw the guy, but she said that she didn't. I was hopeful security got them, but was also worried that he just ran off again. It wasn't until the next day that things took a turn for the worse. When I arrived on Tuesday, I didn't see this guy and was relieved that he realized his pranks weren't funny anymore. However, today was going to be a half day for me, so after I got Mary settled in for a nap, I decided to wait in the living room until her daughter showed up. I thought I would clean up and dust for a bit, so I went to open the curtains, and there he was, staring right into the window. I screamed, jumping backwards, trying to catch my breath as my heart plummeted into my stomach. The fact that he didn't budge within this time also snapped me back and caused me to get a hold of myself. If he was there to break in, why didn't he take off? Or even try to come in, break the window, anything? So I approached the window to get a better look at his face. As I mentioned, he looked pale, but by the wrinkles or creases in his face, I could tell he had caked on makeup, like a clown. There was some wiped off or faded around his mouth and eyes, almost dripping, like he had been crying or drooling maybe, or just spilling liquid from his mouth. He continued to smile as he slowly lifted a piece of paper that said "Smile" on it. At this point, I closed the curtains, double-checked to make sure the door was locked, and went and grabbed my phone. I called security first when they asked me if he was still at the window. I went to check, slowly pushing the curtain aside, but he was gone. I'm not sure if I was relieved or more worried about that. After getting off the phone with them, I called 911 as well. It was kind of trespassing with them trying to look into the window, so at least that's what I told myself. They both showed up and were patrolling the area for a few hours at that point. They even went to the condos around the area, asking if anyone else had contact with this guy. Several of them did, but it was never more than in the parking lot. I was the only one that experienced him screaming or even approaching the actual home. From that day, they actually had a cop patrolling the area throughout the day, but the guy never showed up. In fact, he was never seen again after that. I know this may sound wimpy, but it was truly a terrifying experience. And sometimes the less you know makes things even worse. I've talked to my friends and parents about this before, but no matter what, I still have no idea what this guy's motives were. If it was a prank, it was a terrible one. He could have easily caused someone to have a heart attack or worse. I also don't understand the suit or the briefcase. I still wonder what could have been in it, if anything, and why the sign with a smile on it. And of course, how was he able to get away so quickly every time without anyone catching him? All I can say is, I'm glad he never came back and that everyone there was okay. I just hope he didn't try to do it to anyone else. This actually occurred to my mother, but it's something I've always held on to since she told me. I know it probably wasn't easy for her to recall and talk about, but I'm thankful she did. So forgive me if I'm missing a few pieces here or there, or if it's out of order, as I'm trying to recall everything she told me. When I was about 5, my parents tried for a second kid, to have a boy and a girl. My mom had medical issues that made getting pregnant difficult for them, but that didn't knock them down. After several failed attempts, they learned she was pregnant and went to the normal appointments to make sure the baby and mom were safe and healthy. Everything was going fine too. No complications with the pregnancy until about the time they learned the gender. It was going to be another boy, but they were still very thankful to have a second on the way, so no big deal. But my mom started having some pretty weird dreams, or more so, nightmares. She never really talked about them with my dad or anyone other than just saying she had a weird dream, because she never really thought about it. At least, she didn't until it became a recurring dream. In the dream, she was always lying on what appeared to be a hospital bed in an all-white room. The walls were white. There were several large spotlight-style lights hanging all around to where she couldn't see anything else in the room. She could tell there were people or figures in the room as they were human-shaped, but could never see their faces. They always seemed to be standing in front of the lights, so all she could see was the outline of a head, shoulders, arms, torsos, down to the legs. Oh, she did say that she never got off the bed. She doesn't remember if she tried or just couldn't or just never attempted. But because of this, she thinks either the bed was really low to the ground and or with the lights being behind them, it distorted the figures. Either that or their arms were freakishly long. As it looked like from where they were standing, their arms seemed to almost reach the ground. The first few times she had this dream, she just laid there and kept asking where she was and who they were. She said all she could hear was some kind of whispering, but it wasn't in a language she was familiar with at least. My mom is fluent in English, Spanish, and knows enough Italian to be able to tell if it was any of those, to which she says it wasn't. I know there are thousands of languages out there, but she said it just didn't seem real. It was almost just gibberish to her. However, one other thing my mom was fluent in was ASL, American Sign Language. My maternal grandparents and one of my uncles were deaf, so it was something she learned growing up. She noticed the figures were using their hands a lot, and she could make out some motions they were making, so she gave it a shot and asked them again what was going on in sign language. To her surprise, she got a response. They told her they didn't know she could understand them, and she explained how she knew ASL, and again asked who they were. They didn't answer her, but said they were trying to figure out what to do with the baby. She was confused at first, but said she finally realized they meant her baby that she was carrying. She asked them if he was okay or if there was something wrong, but all they said was, "It doesn't belong to you." She said this was typically where the dream ended. She would wake up confused but not scared or anything and would go about her day. But she started having this dream almost every night, and she tried to get more and more information from them, but the answers were few and far in between. The ones she remembers vividly, and always scared her, were the ones where she was being told the baby doesn't belong to her. He needed to go with them and that he would be safer with them. She started getting increasingly upset and yelling at them, saying he was hers and that she wasn't going to let anyone take him or harm him, and they would end up sedating her and she would wake up. After waking up more than a few times disheveled and upset, my dad started asking her about these dreams. They brought it up to the doctor, simply explaining she was having nightmares about Ken, his name was Kenneth, and they just suggested changing up her diet, thinking that could affect her sleep. She did just that, changed how she was eating and when, but the dreams didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to get worse. She said the figures would approach her and seem to pinch her everywhere. Her arms, her chest, face, and legs all burned as it felt like she was being pinched all over. But when she would wake up, there were no marks anywhere on her body. Then, at about 34 weeks, I believe it was, she had a different dream. This time, one of the figures spoke English, and they told her it was time and that she should say her goodbyes now. She remembered an overwhelming feeling of grief, but she had no fight in her. She laid there staring at them. After some time, the room went dark and she watched the figures walk out of sight. That's when she woke up and told my dad she needed to go to the hospital. She said she didn't know why, but she felt like something was wrong. They got to the hospital, did a sonogram, and noticed there was no movement and no heartbeat. They did an emergency C-section, but he was gone and nothing they did brought him back. That night, my little brother Ken passed. They said it was basically a stillbirth situation, and there was nothing my mom could have done to cause or prevent it. It was a hard time for my parents, especially trying to explain to me, I'm sure, not understanding what was going on. I sadly don't remember much of the situation, being such a young age at the time. But the strangeness didn't end there. My mom stopped having those dreams until about a week or so after his death. She had one more dream, but it was different. This time, she was sitting in the nursery chair that was in Ken's room. She saw the same dark figures appear in the room, but this time there were no bright lights. They were just dark, with no features. One of them was holding a small baby in their arms, wrapped in some kind of blanket. She knew immediately, though, that it was Ken. She said one of them thanked her for him and that he would be well taken care of. Even though she told me this as an adult, it terrified me. However, she said she had never been more at peace than in that situation. She simply asked to hold him and they obliged. She recalled while telling me this that how you would normally feel someone's arm or hands as you pass a baby to or from them, she didn't feel anything but Ken. She took Ken from them and she said she held him for what felt like hours. Nothing around her mattered in that moment. After some time, she heard the figure that spoke say it was time to go and that she would never see them again. Then she heard a small child's voice say, "I'm okay. I love you." And then they were gone. She said when she woke up that morning, she felt rested and she felt like she had clarity and was ready to move forward. She said she explained this dream to my dad, but it definitely affected him differently. He went through the normal grief stages, from what my mom said, but at the end of it all, she knew everything was okay, and she did her best to convince my dad of that too. But even though she seemed to be at peace with the situation, they both agreed they did not want to try again. Since my mom already had medical issues, not to mention the traumatic dreams, she didn't want to risk it. She only shared the dreams in detail with my dad and her close friend. She was too afraid of what others would think of her, or if someone would try to take me away as she was unstable or something. But I'm thankful she shared with me, even though it scared the hell out of me too. To this day, there is still no explanation to any of it, and it's the biggest mystery of our family. I think I'd like to believe my mom's side of things on this one though, and believe that Ken is okay, or that he at least didn't suffer anything, and that maybe one day I'll meet him again. I love riding my bike at night. Being able to go out with no music and just listen to the night sounds was always so therapeutic for me. I didn't need any music to drown out other people or cars passing. I could listen to the wind as it weaved through the trees or ran through my hair. I could listen to the crickets chirp and the frogs croak in the creek running along the side of the road, or even just the sound of my tire spinning as I glided along the road. I worked a later shift, so I was usually home around 9 or 10 p.m. I'd go change, then head out for an hour or so before I went back home to shower and go to bed. On this night, I didn't have to work the next day, and I was really itching for something new, so I decided to ride a little further and off the path that I normally took. I went around the block as I normally do, cut across the street and past the gas station. I was now further than I had ever really gone. I didn't feel uneasy or nervous though. I actually almost had a second wind in me exploring a new area. There was an underdeveloped area nearby as new homes were being built, so I told myself I would ride around in there, then start heading back. That way I didn't wear myself out, making the ride back exhausting. I was going over all these newly paved roads, making it one of the smoothest rides I had ever been on. It also made it extremely quiet, to where it was just my tires and the crickets in the distance. Until I started hearing singing, or humming rather. At first, I just thought it was another person enjoying the night, until it finally registered where I was. There were no houses here yet. It was just the roads along the outside of the soon-to-be homes. There were a few foundations laid out and frames set up, but no actual houses. Why would there be people around? I slowed down a bit so I could hear the singing better. The song sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. It was just the music though, as I mentioned, no lyrics. As I went around the bend, the humming got louder, and I could make out the song. It was Stand By Me. I could almost sing along with it with how well the humming was. I stopped my bike and began to look around between the few construction machines and frames with a flashlight on my phone. As I walked past one of the plots and around a pile of dirt and rocks, I could see a woman sitting in the dirt, swaying side to side. I just stood there for a few seconds, watching and listening to her. The song came to an end, and after a few seconds, she just started singing again. My clumsy ass, however, missed the dip in the ground in front of me, causing me to stumble a bit. When I did this, I of course made a gasp, and there was probably a sound as my feet shuffled, trying to regain my balance. All of this was enough to cause her to stop singing and swaying. She slowly stood up, but never turned around to face me. The whole situation was pretty eerie, but I didn't really feel scared until she stood up. My fight or flight instinct kicked in, and I immediately apologized and turned around to go back to my bike. As I kicked the stand and got back on, she began screaming. It made me jump, and I took off as fast as I could on my bike. The whole time, she continued screaming as I rode away. Even after I was out of that new neighborhood, I could still hear her in the distance. I crossed the street, so I was on the same side of the lights the whole way home. When I got there, I quickly put my bike on my patio instead of my garage like I usually did, ran inside and locked the door. I told a few friends about this, and we all laugh about it now, but holy hell, that was one of the creepiest things I had ever experienced. And no, I haven't gone back, but there are a few houses there now. Good luck to them. Although very amateur, I consider myself an avid ghost hunter. I love listening to and reading ghost stories, as well as watching a few shows on TV. I could only tolerate some of them, as I felt others were over-dramatized and made the real ones look watered down. I loved looking for old abandoned places or haunted buildings to explore. Thankfully, I was never alone in my ventures. I had two other friends that were just as enthusiastic as myself. Rachel and Harlan were typically with me in every building I went through. I got a bonus at work, so I treated myself to a new and better EMF reader and a digital audio recorder. I had just been using either the recorder on a spare smartphone or a cheap battery-operated tape recorder, and I had been wanting to get a professional one. Of course, once I received them, I was itching to go somewhere to try it out, but I wanted to go somewhere new. So after some discussing and planning, the three of us decided to check out a building that was supposedly haunted. We learned about this building through a site with a list of abandoned buildings in our area. There were comments saying it definitely had some paranormal activity going on, and for the most part, it wasn't monitored or guarded, and there were no signs saying you couldn't enter, so we decided to go for it. The night comes for our adventure, So Rachel and Harlan meet at my place so we could all drive out there together. When we arrived, there wasn't really much in the way of a parking lot or driveway because of how old it is, so we parked on the side where the grass seemed to thin out. The outside itself looked like it could tell a story all on its own. It looked like a small castle. It was made of brick that looked in between a light gray to white. It had rounded corners with really nice looking arched windows. The side that we parked on looked like it shifted some, like it was starting to sink or maybe fall, but it didn't look like it would be a safety issue, so we decided to still go in. It had a heavy wooden door that opened inward. We had to push on it pretty hard as it seemed to catch on the floor due to it being slanted over time. I mentioned this to keep in mind that it takes a little force to get it to move. I started by pulling out the camera I had to do an intro including who all was here and where we were. Then I gave Rachel my EMF reader to use, as Harlan had his own, and I set up my new recorder. We all stayed together to walk through the bottom floor. The living room still had an old couch in it. It had dust on it, but looked like it had been disturbed recently. It was entirely possible, as others have checked this place out before, but there was still that idea that someone else could have been nearby that was kind of unsettling. There was a huge frame that hung above a fireplace, but whatever was in it had been cut out. There was a small kitchen with an old-style oven in it. Then we saw a room that was pretty much empty, but it had bookshelves on all sides. I think it may have been some kind of library or study or some sort. We weren't getting any hits on the EMF, so we decided to move upstairs. The second floor had a wide walkway that actually looked over to the bottom floor, near the front door. To the right of the stairs was another small room that looked like a den. There weren't any doors, and there was another doorway on the opposite side. We started to go towards the left, which had, I believe, 4 doorways. One was to a pretty simple bathroom with a single disconnected tub. It had a curtain that seemed to go around it, but the bars that held it seemed to have been eaten by the rust and was barely standing. The next door led to a smaller bedroom and, judging by the decor, belonged to a child. The trimming was a light pink or purple with a floral pattern carved out of it. There was no electricity in this place, so the only source of light was the flashlights we were carrying. Nothing was really of interest there, so we moved on. One of the other rooms must have belonged to the adults or the owners of the house. There was a large bed frame in the center of the room, as well as a walk-in closet that actually still had a few things hanging up. Rachel moved the clothes, and as she did this, I got a strong smell of perfume. By the look on her face, I could tell she could smell it too. I figured it just came from the clothes, but she opened up one of the jackets and smelled the inside, but said she couldn't smell it. We just figured it was an odd occurrence and moved on. Rachel was still looking through the closet, and I went back in the room to look around and ask questions like, "Is anyone here with us?" Harlan was with us upstairs at this point, but then he said he was going to go on ahead to the next room. Not long after this, I heard the beeping sound from the EMF reader, and Rachel came walking out of the closet, showing me the screen. We began asking more questions, but the only responses coming out seemed to be static. Sometimes we could hear words or parts of them, but this was just garbled. So we continued asking questions in hopes of getting answers that make sense. Rachel and I left the room we were in and went to the one Harlan was in, and his EMF reader had been going off as well. That room seemed a little more generic. The walls looked an off-white. There was a smaller bed frame with a nightstand next to it, and otherwise the room was pretty empty. We all went to the last room together, and both readers were going crazy. But what was weird to me was that there was nothing in this room but a chair. It looked like an old rocking chair, but the rocker part was broken and rotted out, so the chair was leaning on one side. I told Rachel to set the reader on the chair on a whim, and when she did, it stopped. Harlan's was still going as he held it though. We began asking more questions like, was this your room? Were you still here? Did your life end here? And so on. Then Harlan's reader stopped too. We stood there for several minutes after that, waiting to see if something else happened, but there was nothing. Rachel really enjoyed this, like she never hesitated on going on one of these adventures, but Harlan almost got into these more than I did. So when all activities suddenly stopped, it seemed to upset him. Like we just lost a big catch, so he decided to go outside for a few to gather his thoughts and get something from my car. Rachel and I stayed in the room to see if we could get anything back. She asked for the recorder and began asking questions and just talking aloud. After a series of questions, we heard what sounded like Harlan standing in the hallway and talking. I remember hearing, "This is messed up. What are we doing here?" Rachel and I looked at each other, kind of smirking, as it was, 1, unusual for Harlan to not feel comfortable in these situations, and 2, something we've never really heard him say before. Rachel called out for him, and when there was no response, she started walking towards the doorway and looked around. She said Harlan was nowhere nearby, so I walked over to her to confirm this. That's when we heard a loud slam, followed by banging and Harlan yelling. We quickly started running down the stairs when I noticed the door was closed. We both stopped at the bottom of the stairs. For myself, it was definitely out of confusion, but it couldn't have been more than a few seconds before I started walking towards the door when it came flying open with Harlan on the other side. He had a look of confusion and anger, maybe more so annoyance, when he gave us the normal spiel of, "That wasn't funny, guys." We had to convince him that it wasn't us because we were still upstairs until we heard him talking and the slam. It seemed the talking is what got him to believe us. We explained what we had witnessed, and he said he experienced something quite the same. He heard what sounded like Rachel talking and me laughing when the door shut. He was trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge until it seemed like it was pulling him back in the house as it flew open. That's when the conversation turned to said door. It was slightly off and very heavy. Rachel definitely couldn't move it herself, and if Harlan or I tried to, it took effort as you have to hold it up as you move it, so it wasn't possible for us to do it so quickly. He was definitely in agreement at that point, but then we explained to him that we heard his voice as well. He confirmed what we were already thinking, which was he never went back upstairs either. Something was definitely mimicking our voices. We decided to leave since the door slammed, thinking maybe we were upsetting something, but made plans to go back with more equipment, hopefully a thermal camera. A few days after our trip, I decided to go through the audio we got to see if maybe we could make out some words from the garbled mess. To my amazement, there was nothing the whole time we were trying to talk to it until we were outside with Harlan. I could hear parts of our conversation with him, but when we stopped talking and there was presumably dead air, you could clearly hear on the recording, "Welcome to my home." We heard nothing of the sort while we were standing there. I showed this to the other two and they agreed. We have plans to go back as mentioned, but Harlan was in an accident, so just as soon as he's out of his cast, he wants to go, and I will be sure to share anything else we experience. This happened a few years ago, but it's one of those events that has stuck with me and will probably always have a place in my mind because of how weird it was. I've always been one that liked to go camping and hiking, and I spent a lot of time out in the woods when I was a kid, and that's kind of bled over into my adult years. When I was 19, I went camping with a decent group of my friends. There were about 10 of us total. It's not important to know everyone that was there because most of them were couples that stuck to their tents and the group, but it is important to know myself, M, and K were all best friends and were on the trip together. We were actually sharing a tent with the three of us, if that tells you anything. It was starting to get late, and we had a fire going for the group, and one of the couples mentioned that they had marshmallows and that they wanted good pointed sticks for roasting them over the fire. Another then mentioned that we also needed a bit more wood for our fire, which was pretty much just brush that we found around. I said that we would go look for some wood so that the couples didn't have to leave their spots, mostly because I didn't want to hear anyone complaining, and I knew that M and K would be willing to go out into the woods with me. So we got up and started out into the trees to find some suitable burning material first, then found some good roasting sticks. We were walking through the woods and found some decent brush, but after getting what we needed, we started heading back towards the camp. And after a few minutes, it seemed like we weren't making any progress. I was certain that we were heading in the right direction, but for whatever reason, it seemed like we were only going deeper into the woods. M was a bit panicky, saying that we were definitely lost, but I was telling her that there was no way we could have gotten lost, so close to where we started. I stood there for a moment and looked around, trying to regain my bearings on the direction that we had gone and where we had come from, and I was absolutely certain that the group should have been right by where we were. I asked Kay what she thought, and she said that we had definitely walked in the right direction, and she confirmed what I was already thinking. I asked M to grab her cell phone and see if she could get a hold of one of the other people in the group and see if they could yell for us since we had to be somewhere nearby. She then mentioned that she didn't have her phone on her, that she had left it in her tent. I then asked Kay if she had hers, and she said no. I rolled my eyes, annoyed, and basically shoved the bundle of sticks I was holding at M so I could get my cell phone out of my pocket. Much to my frustration, my phone was showing that it had no service whatsoever. I kept trying to hit the call button to get a hold of any of our friends, and it kept canceling the call due to being outside of service area. I then tried to pull up maps thinking that maybe I could get data instead of call service, but no luck. At this point, I basically just said that we should keep going and try to yell to see if any of our friends replied. We shouted a few times, but there was no response. After walking for a few moments, again in the direction that we assumed was the camp, we saw what looked like a shed in the middle of the trees. I thought it was weird, but I also figured that we may have ended up on someone's property, though it was a bit strange that it was just out in the middle of the trees and that there were no buildings anywhere near the little shed. I walked up to it to look in the windows and see if there was anything that could help us, or something like that, but it was mostly empty. I could see that there were some tools on the wall, like an axe, a shovel, and all that, but there was also a small pile of clothing that was folded nicely, sitting on what looked like a small dresser. That was literally all there was in the shed. Just the tools, the dresser, and the clothing, which was a bit freaky. Was someone living out here or something? I decided that we should keep moving since if someone was living here, they might come back, and I didn't want to deal with some random person living in a shed in the woods. We kept walking for what felt like forever, almost like we had been going for a few hours, but then I heard what sounded like one of our friends shouting M's name. I shouted back and asked if they were nearby, and they shouted back. The three of us pretty much ran to where their voice was coming from, and after a few minutes we could see the light of the fire as well as our group of tents. It was a major relief to see them, but what was really weird was the fact that we had somehow ended up approaching the camp from the opposite side from where we left. When we got back to the camp, the one friend that was yelling mentioned that we had been gone for something like 15 minutes, though to us, it felt like a lot more time than that. We then mentioned that we had to have been gone for a lot longer, but everyone confirmed that it was 15 minutes. I mentioned that there was a shed, but I don't think any of them believed us, and we never found where it was again. It was just really weird to me that we were headed to the camp and somehow got lost. There's no way that we were going the wrong way, nor had we gone too deep into the woods. I guess my question is, did we end up finding some strange pocket dimension in the woods that we shouldn't have found? Was this some kind of place outside of time or something? I have no idea, but it was seriously freaky, if nothing else. So that, my friends, was a collection of unexplained stories. These are one of my favorites because of how open for interpretation they are. Like, you don't really know the reasoning for any of them. I mean, sure, we could probably ask the creepy people why they were like that, but can't exactly ask in the dreams and the woods what happened there. So, also that kind of fear of the unknown, which is always a good one. So what's your take on any of these? Or do you have any explanation that you can think of? Let me know in the comments below. And if you did enjoy this video, please do give it a like. And if you'd like to hear more content like this, consider subscribing if you haven't already. And with that being said, friends, I hope you have a fantastic rest of the week. And until the next time, take care.